All right, so right now, only 7 commitments in the class for Mississippi State. Number 34 in the country nationally, according to 247 Sports. Headlining Christian Alexander at running back, 4-star out of Tunica. There's a couple, big-time running backs in the state, and you would expect State to be able to get one of them. Christian Alexander is one of those guys. 5'8", 195, so a little bit on the smaller side. But, you've seen State take a few of those guys. They like the kind of the more explosive back types, and that's what you're getting there. You signed 2 outstanding backs last year. You're going to lose Fluff Bothwell after this year, I would imagine, based on some of the early projections. But running back is not an area where I think you need to take a ton, but State could – I think there's another running back in the class State might look to get. But at the very least, if you're going to have one guy and 4-star, top 10 player within the state of Mississippi, great pickup. Caleb Unger out of Madison, out of MRA. Interior offensive line prospect, 6'2", 300, 89 overall player, top 15 prospect in the state. This is a good pickup for MSU, and we'll talk about it here in a bit. That offensive line is one of those spots where it's really important that they do well this year in terms of their commitments. And Unger, if you read up the profile on him, literally the only thing that's preventing him from being a firm 4-star player across the board is just the size. 6'2", 300, you would ideally like to have a bigger frame. But everything, you read the breakdown that's on 247, projects as a guy that'd be a multi-year start at the power conference level. He's got some good offers. That's a good pickup for State. And again, O-line's a spot that's going to be really important. Javarius Griffin, a wide receiver out of Cleveland, 88 overall, 6 foot, 185, speed guy. It fits the profile of what Mississippi State is looking for of the receivers, explosive play potential. That was a really good pickup for them. Sutton Gutting out of Riverdale High School up in Tennessee, tight end, 6'5", 225, big frame, 88 overall, 3-star. Very much a inline blocking type is what you would expect there. And kind of how you would expect him to help the class. I don't think tight end is going to be an area that State hits heavily this year because you committed 3 last season, and every single guy you got on the roster can come back in 2027. But getting another kind of physical guy in the class, especially after last year, bringing in Zayon Cotton. I believe Adam Land, we've talked about, has some receiving ability to him as well. Getting that guy who's more of a physical type to have in there is certainly a good pickup. Brandon Allen Jr. is going to be a name to watch for State. Out of Atlanta, corner, 6'2", 175, 87 overall. Really rangy player. Big-time tackler, if you go and watch. He's a guy that's going to fly downhill and make plays. So a physical player at corner with obviously the length and the speed to be that guy on the outside. There's been a lot of talk of other programs getting involved here. Virginia Tech, South Carolina, I believe Florida State, Auburn. Several different programs have come up for Brandon Allen as him showing a lot of interest. This is going to be one to watch for State. And, how well are they going to be able to hold on to him? If they can hold on to him, it's a great, great addition because, again, it's a big frame, really talented player. Could easily end up being a 4-star when it's all said and done. You want to keep him in the class for sure. But it's going to be a battle. Hudson Fuqua out of Murfreesboro, another guy out of Riverdale. You got 2 guys from Riverdale, and then also I think they're recruiting a quarterback from Riverdale for next year for the 2028 class. 5'11", 180 safety, 87 overall. Just a guy that can very clearly understands where he's supposed to be on the field. Just sort of always going to get his nose to the football. Really good play recognition, which is what you're looking for from the safety spot. Purdue kind of heavily involved there, but MSU has held that commitment. And then Tricarian Collins is another safety, 85 overall out of Ridgeland, 6'2", 175. The offer list for him, Arkansas, Ole Miss, but Alabama mixed in there as well. This feels like a guy where the rating would probably be higher. It probably will be higher as it goes along. And this is someone that State recently got that commitment back in April. And you read up the scouting report, really high on him with the size and the athleticism, and has a chance to really shoot up the recruiting ranks. So this, for a guy that State's got on board here pretty early, could end up being one of those gems in the class that State was able to get that commitment early on in the process. So you've got a good group committed thus far, but obviously it's just not the numbers. Only 7 commitments. as it stands presently for Mississippi State. But the guys you've got in the class, it's a good group, and all guys that project as power conference players for sure. You're not talking about – we talked about last year Mississippi State. It felt like a ton of their early commitments were guys that you look at their offer sheet, and it's like, man, Mississippi State is the only big-time offer this player has. It's like, why are you going after these players? This year, you don't have a ton of the numbers just yet. And again, you expect that to bulk up in the coming months. These are all guys that are good players that you have other programs very interested in at the power conference and also at the SEC level. So State's off to a pretty solid start. And like I mentioned, you got a couple guys in there that, that may be 3 stars, but really the talent level is higher. In terms of what's going to matter in this year's class and what State's going to be after, offensive line, I mentioned it. I think it's going to be really big for them this year. Purely from the standpoint of, like, you've got to get some young, homegrown talent that you can build around. When you look at State and the offensive line classes from the past couple of years, I would say the past 2 years, you've gotten some guys in there that you feel have the opportunity to grow and develop. But when we looked at State's portal class this year for offensive line, one of the things that I talked about was you notice they're taking a lot of young guys, taking a lot of guys that State would have loved to have had out of high school but ended up going elsewhere. And it felt like the reason State took this approach of we're not just going after offensive linemen who we expect to play this season was because they felt they needed offensive linemen that they could get into the program and develop over multiple years to become starters down the line. Because they felt like the young offensive linemen they had on the roster were not guys that project to do that. So the reason you go get Mario Nash and LJ Perdome and Tyler Miller is because those are guys that can continue to develop, and you would expect down the line that can be a big-time player within the SEC versus some of the guys that were recruited before we got here, or some of the guys we recruited and signed ourselves. It's just not going to cut. They're not going to cut it. You got to change that. You've got to start getting those guys in the program early. And I know it's tough with offensive line in the portal era because a lot of those guys don't want to stay. And also, look, frankly, the coaches, I've said this too, the coaches are guilty of, cutting that weight early with O-line and not letting that play out because they want to go and get the contributors. But State's got to figure out offensive line more. And, fortunately for them, I do think there's a lot of talented offensive linemen in the state. Now, as we'll get to here in a bit, they're not really in the running for some of the top guys, but they've got a couple really nice offensive linemen that they are competing for. I mean, one of those is Unger and having his commitment, but you have another guy who's now an out-of-state player that they're going to be pushing for as well, who could be a really, really nice commitment for them. Defensive line for the same reason, but also because of bodies. I think you're going to have 5 defensive linemen at least graduating from the program next year. A lot of guys from the starting line, or a lot of guys from the 2 deep, they're going to be moving on after next season of the defensive line. You've got to get some young talent in there. And that's another one of those problems for Mississippi State is the young defensive line talent is not what it needs to be. Now, this year's class ended up being positive. The reports I've heard from the guy State signed this year on the defensive line, it's one of the better groups they've brought in a long time. You got to stack that, though. It can't be that you only get one of those guys in the class. You got one guy who projects as a power conference player maybe in a few years, but then the other guys are just sort of developmental. We'll see what happens. You need to go out and win some battles for some really talented defensive linemen. The thing that used to never be a question for Mississippi State, getting the big-time defensive linemen, they've failed to do that. That's got to change this year. And it can't just be all those guys go to Ole Miss, which has been the problem recently. There's big-time defensive line talent in the state. There always is, but this year specifically, there's some really good defensive linemen. You got to get a couple of those guys on board. I think safety is going to be important, and they've already got a couple of good safeties committed because they're losing a lot of safeties after this year. Linebacker is another arguable one because you didn't take any high school linebackers last year, and you look at the next year, like you're not losing anybody after this season. Well, I mean, Zachary Tillman will be gone, and I guess you never know if anybody's going to make a move for whatever reason. But everybody else has the ability to come back. Then you're going to be seeing a lot of guys move on. Assuming that everybody stuck around, Jalen Smith, Darian Gillette would both be done. There's somebody that I'm forgetting who would be a senior at that point. Also, I mean, hey, let's say Tyler Lockhart doesn't kill it for the next 2 years, and then he's done. You obviously hope to have him 4 years, but if he's gone after 3 years, that means he was awesome. I think linebackers a spot might be interesting for State to watch in this class and how they choose to go about that. So real quick, just to kind of talk about some of the guys in the class this year in 2027 that you're going to be making a push for and some of their big targets. And let me actually go to the top players in the state of Mississippi. Let me pull that up. So if you go to the top 10, Mitchell Turner, 4-star defensive lineman out of Louisville, 94 overall, top player in the state. Projected for Alabama as it stands right now, but Mississippi State's been pushing, and Mississippi State seems to have an opportunity here. That would be massive, man. If you could find a way to get the number one player in the state, it'd be absolutely huge, especially at a position like that. Now, Caden Moss, and I'll go ahead and hit Caden Moss and Antonio Berry, a pair of 4-star offensive linemen here in the state. Neither of them are committed. Both of them have already released kind of top 4s, top 5, with Mississippi State not included. So that's where I mentioned in-state linemen. Unger is a good pickup, and then there's some other guys down the board who look like some good additions potentially, but then there's also one out-of-state kid, as I'll get to. But the top 2 linemen in the state, State feels like they've kind of missed the boat there. So unless you can find a way to get back into it, you're not going to get one of those top offensive linemen in Mississippi this season. Majarvis Shoemaker, another defensive lineman out of Ackerman, 92 overall, 4-star, Ole Miss commit, but Mississippi State's getting them on campus. So you want to make a push there. Sam Lejeune out of Poplarville, 4-star. This one's really important for Mississippi State. And unfortunately, it feels like there's a lot of other programs, Florida State especially, that are really in the running there, and that State's maybe not where you would like them to be. But that's a guy that for MSU, you want to make a push for and want to be able to get one of those guys. You have, total this year. That should, 3 of the top 4 players in the state are defensive linemen. And actually, if you go out to the top 5 and you include Derwin Fields at edge, who's a Texas commit that Mississippi State's not going to be able to get in the game for. But yeah, 3 of the top 4 players in the state of Mississippi are really talented defensive linemen. If you're Mississippi State, you got to get one of those guys. Ideally, you'd love to get 2, but you need to get one of those guys to commit. That's a big thing that's got to be able to happen. Continuing down the board, Frederick Ford at linebacker, 4-star out of Greenwood. I don't know if he's released let me see real quick if he's put out a top 4, if anything has happened there. But Mississippi State is in the game there, and he's got a visit coming up later this month. I mentioned linebacker is one of those spots where you would like to potentially add some guys. That's one of those guys to watch. Running back Ty Keys out of Poplarville, already committed to Miami. Then you got Christian Alexander. Tyson Robinson out of Brandon. That's another running back that I think Mississippi State's showing some interest in. And those are all your 4-stars. Now, look, there's still some other good players in the state. Dolph McDonald at corner out of Morton, someone that Mississippi State's very interested in. Devontre Brewer at linebacker. Mississippi State feels like is projected right now. There's a crystal ball in for Mississippi State to be able to land him. Sheldon Isaac at receiver out of Macomb. The expectations for Mississippi State to be able to get that, make that happen. DJ Dotson as an offensive lineman out of Oak Grove is someone that Mississippi State's kind of in the mix for. There's still good players down the board for Mississippi State, including at some positions of need. But again, offensive line, defensive line are those 2 spots that I talk about heavily where I really feel like you need to be able to make something happen. Now, I mentioned out-of-state offensive lineman, sort of the one you're really pushing for. LaMarcus Jones, 6'5", 285 tackle from Brentwood. He's from Mississippi. He's going to be playing at Brentwood Academy next year. So he's made the move up to Tennessee. 90 overall, 4-star. Mississippi State's in a good spot with that recruitment. That's one they really need to try to make happen. If you can get him and Unger in the class as your 2 main offensive linemen, and then you bring in one more guy that's just a good player that maybe you can develop a little bit, that'd be a really good offensive line class for State. But That's one for sure with LaMarcus Jones. So that's really the big thing for me. Like LaMarcus Jones, one of the top defensive linemen. If you get those guys and then can add a few other pieces around them, you start to feel pretty good about this being a big class. It could also be a case for Mississippi State, kind of like we saw this last year, where the momentum has to come as you get closer to signing day. I talked about earlier last year at this time, you looked at the commitment list for Mississippi State. No offense to any of those players, it was pathetic. You had a lot of guys committed in the class that were not projected as power conference players. But State just had to have guys committed. Once the season went along and State started to show like, hey, this program is moving in the right direction. Also, State started to get some things taken care of from an NIL standpoint, frankly. You were able to get some guys in the class and get some really big wins down the stretch. Obviously, none more notable than Braylon Womack and then Micah Nickerson. Getting those two guys in the class was absolutely massive. State could still do a ton of work in the fall and in the weeks leading up to signing day. You know, we've seen that now. But you would love to be able to get that momentum created a little bit earlier. So pivotal few weeks for Mississippi State, pivotal next couple months really for MSU on the recruiting trail. They're off to a solid start with the class, but you got a couple spots you definitely have to address and get a little bit better at down the stretch.